Our next panelist is Teresa Stoppani. Teresa is an architect, an architectural theorist, and a critic based in London, where she lectures in history and theory studies at Architecture Association. She's the author of Paradigm Islands, Manhattan and Venice, and of Unorthodox Ways to Think the City. She's the co-editor of the collection of essays, This Thing Called Theory, and an editor of the Journal of Architecture and the instigator of the International Architectural Research Collective, This Thing Called Theory. Teresa, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Pari, for the introduction. Thank you for having me. It's a fantastic weekend, considering that it rains in London. Okay, I'm going to share the screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk about inexact words in architecture, and even my title is, in a way, inexact. Why? There are words in architecture that perdure beyond definitions, cultures, and times. Because they don't change, they change. So they are malleable, they're stretchable, they reset themselves again and again. And they do that to adhere to something that changes continuously, essentially life. And it is because they don't change that they change. So what I would like to argue here in relation to the theme of these 2 days, and in defense of what I call the unexact or inexact words, is that it's in the crucial space between word and thing and space that the project of architecture becomes possible and can remain active. And so it's in these words that perdure, that it allows us to plot continuities and transformations and to work through adaptation and permanence and change because we continue to use them. We use them across languages, cultures, and geographies. And then translations, of course, further open up the space of potentiality of the project as a word takes on meanings and sheds meanings in its journeys. So I would like to suggest that it is the words that attach themselves to the changeable and the unnameable that last longer because they change, because they don't change. Where I am, I don't know. I will never know. That's Beckett. Again, we saw it, some of it yesterday with Francesca. Where now, who now, and when now? And these are the words with which Beckett begins his questioning in the unnameable. An interrogation in which the I is endlessly iterated, I, but the most probed, it remains the most unfathomable presence in the novel. The unnameable narrator, quote, so named because he knows not who he may be, unquote, is the one we get to know in the novel, while he continues to wonder where, who, when. So while acknowledging the Aristotelian categories of place, time, and action, these are here dissolved. Yet the impossibility of ever knowing frames those repeated now at the beginning as a next, as a possibility and an impossibility, and as a compulsion to a future of change and questioning, in which, because I'll never know, I'll go on. Beckett writes and publishes this first in French, Innommable. And then he spends more time translating himself than in the writing of the novel. And the translation is essentially a rewriting. It's a transformation. One of the changes that occur, and this is highlighted by Steve Connor in the preface of the 2010 English edition of the book, is the move of the unfathomable I of the story at the very beginning. The I who slips, it slides in between where and when. And so, où maintenant, quand maintenant, qui maintenant becomes why now, who now, when now. The I is set in motion, relating to place and time, but also questioning and redefining them in a changed set of relations. I'd like to start with exact as a verb, to exact from the Latin exigere, an inner demand rather than an imposed requirement. Exagere is, first of all, pushing out from within, before exactitude becomes something of a requirement or an expectation. And indeed, the motivation that we find in Calvino's lecture on exactitude comes from within. And his American lessons, Lezioni Americane is the Italian title of the 6 memos, are at once a literary autobiographical account and the gift of a legacy to other writers, but also to us who compose, assemble, design, imagine, and yes, always approximate. What Calvino teaches us is the value of our approximations and the fact that they do not approximate a given something or a something to achieve, but work with it and within it. Exactitude is in the work of those approximations. It is not perfection. And the 6 memos, as we know, are not 6, but 5, because death intervenes to exact us from ourselves. So even in dying, we are not perfect. Even exactitude, the text, Calvino's text, begins with an oscillation. Calvino opens with a reference to Maat, the Egyptian goddess of scales, symbolized, he tells us, by a feather that served as a weight on scales used for the weighing of souls. And here we see 2 of them. One is part of the scale, one is on the scale. Even Maat, the feather, is twofold, though. The hieroglyph, Calvino explains, stands for a unit of length and also for the fundamental note of the flute. It's a reference that measures and is repeated, and one that is a starting point, different ways to keep deviation in check, different behaviors. From there, Calvino's lessons or memo unfolds, and it gives us some sort of a methodology and a perfect question mark example of a construction of a text and an argument. I've just returned from Italy, and my copy of Lezioni Americane there is clean. It only has the dedication from a dear friend who gave it to me as a present for my own enjoyment. The 6 memos that I have in London instead is so heavily annotated that it's impossible to reread it afresh, as if such a thing were ever possible. I used it to teach to architecture students how to structure an argument in a text and to show the impossible work of exactitude. They are not the same texts, though. Even if Calvino here is sort of translating himself and insists on quoting as well as translating his many original sources, Italian, German, French, and even the often impenetrable Dante. But the whole text itself is an oscillation, ultimately between Maat, the measurer, and Maat, the trigger of imagination, composition, of work. Here, Calvino moves from Leopardi's attempt in the Zibaldone to defy vagueness through word images where, quote, the search for the indefinite becomes the observation of all that is multiple, teeming, composed of countless particles. Towards the end of the text, Leonardo's three versions of the description of an animal, a sort of a sea monster he interprets from its fossilized remains, which in fact becomes a conjecture of how the animal moves in the sea, looming, swirling, furrowing, translating Leonardo. Exactitude is not a static affair, but a pursuit destined for and aiming at failure. That is, if by non-failure we mean perfection. So we have an oscillation. And we find Roland Barthes in Calvino's text on exactitude. There's a reference to him as, and I quote, in whose mind the demon of exactitude lived side by side with the demon of sensitivity. Calvino here is thinking of Barthes's claim for a mathesis singularis rather than a mathesis universalis in camera lucida. But it's really in his lectures on the neutral that Barthes discusses the virtues of oscillation as hesitation, seeing not as a paralyzing or stalling, but as the space for, Barthes' words, the more agreeable, the unexpected that could occur. And both as, quote again, functioning as an objective device, not like a disorder, an anomy, a difficult margin, but all being said like a reconquest, a stabilization, a working on one's image. So Barthes sees the neutral, quote again, it as a discourse, and as such as a scream or a noise through which something is being said by the subject unknowingly or knowingly, but unacknowledgedly. The section on oscillation in Barthes' lecture on the neutral could almost be read as the continuation or a complement to Calvino's text on exactitude. It is by confronting related words that one refines meanings, differences, nuances. Nuance is one of the linguistic tools of non-arrogance, of non-intolerance. And here Barthes probes the different meanings of the three ancient Greek words that indicate different forms of the neutral. We have the grammatical neutral, the odouteron, neither one nor the other. The political one, the mesos in the middle. But the third one is what interests him more, the heteroklitos, he who leans on one side and the other. Or those words whose declension proceeds from different themes, irregular words, the irregular, the unforeseeable, the one following the other without order. I hope that by now it's transpiring that I'm circuitously approaching my topic, those words that we use in architecture and continue to use, even when what they refer to changes or has changed or is changing. They're elastic words for their capacity to stretch over and embrace that which is changing or new or surprising or planned, but ultimately uncontrollable. They feign a stability. They roof over mutations that both corrode and enrich an origin that often we cannot find simply because it's not one, but many, always, already. What, of course, immediately comes to mind is the idea of type as defined by Quatre-Mers de Quincy, the more or less vague of the type which, I'm paraphrasing, is a nucleus for complexity of spatial arrangements that are adaptable. but not only generated by function. The type as such is not a static form, but a multiplicity of variations. And the type operates, and here are Quatremer's words, like a sort of nucleus about which are collected and to which are coordinated in time the developments and variations of forms to which the object is susceptible. Generative flexibility, vagueness, non-representativity characterize it. It is a flexible tool that is informative rather than formal, that cannot be represented as a form, but only as an interpretative accumulation of forms in constant modification. Molded according to the occasion, writes Quatremer, to perform as critical agents. And so this vagueness in the type thus defined questions the stability of form, and of course opens the language to, again, the oscillation of the multiple. What we have here is architect and artist Lieven de Boek's manifesto from a series called The Seven Sins of Urbanism. This manifesto, in particular, is for the suppression of typology, not type, from urbanism. For the book, the attractiveness of what it calls the non-dénommé, which I'm sorry is the very, very small font at the end of the text, derives from its challenging of function. The modernist language of architecture is subjected here to even wider oscillation, to question the given of function, incorporate instead the unexpected, the yet unnamed. Calvino, of course, in considering exactitude and as an oscillation, inevitably comes to consider the city as a complex symbol that gives, I quote his words, greater possibilities of expressing the tension between geometric rationality and the entanglements of human lives. He explains the structure of his book, Invisible Cities. I built up a many-faceted structure in which, I built up a many-faceted structure in which each brief text is close to the other in a series that does not imply logical sequence or a hierarchy, but a network in which one can follow multiple routes and draw multiple ramified conclusions. He continues, in my invisible cities, every concept and value turns out to be double, even exactitude. So it is the construction of the many names of the city that Calvino is able to keep at play with these tensions. He observes that his search for exactitude in the invisible cities and in the construction of the relations moves at once in two directions. On one hand, the reduction toward the reduction of secondary events to abstract patterns, according to which one can carry out operations to demonstrate the theorems, and on the other, the effort made by words to present the tangible aspects of things as precisely as possible. And this was pretty much also in the call of our conversations today. But as he renders visible through words the many cities that he constructs, what remains is the word city. It is a constant that enables connection, builds bridges between Marco Polo and Kubla Khan in the fiction. It is city, the image that allows Calvino to connect these many images of cities he constructs. They have their own name, but they always have one and the same name, city. City enables communication and builds that bridge, in this case, making invisible cities visible. And here we have, again, the two approaches to it. On one hand, Kublai Khan, the model is already the norm. It contains everything and can foresee even the exception from the norm. And on the other hand, we have Marco, who thinks of a city instead made of exceptions, exclusions, incongruities, contradictions. If such a city is the most improbable, by reducing the number of normal elements, we increase the probability that the city really exists. The perfect city does not exist. Under the name city, we also welcome those magnetic fields jammed with objects. I'm quoting Manfredo Tafuri, as he finds them in Giovanni Battista Piranesi, inevitably present in these days, city, the Campo Marzio. Tafuri had analyzed the dissolution of form, as he calls it, in Piranesi's Carceri, but here, I quote, it touches urban structure. It touches both history, in as much as it is a principle of value and an instrument of action, and the very concept of the city. For Tafuri, the Campo Marzio, and the words he uses are almost the equivalent of the image we are looking at now. I quote, is composed of a formless heap of fragments colliding one against the other. It is the triumph of the fragment dominated by the formless tangle of the spurious organism. And then he continues, not by accident does it take on the appearance of a homogeneous magnetic field jammed with objects having nothing to do with each other. But they do not have anything to do with each other. They collide, they break forms, and as fragments, they have to reinvent their relations. So what interests Tafuri here is that their clash dissolves even, I'm quoting, even the remotest memory of the city as a place of form. And so he sees, again, him in Campo Marzio, a representation of an active decomposition of the totality of form. And this, of course, means not only the form of the architectural object, but also the form of the city. So what next? Well, let's stay here. While Tafuri is working on Piranesi, Colin Rowe is presenting the idea of collage city. But before collage, there is collision, which then leads Rowe to propose what he calls the politics of bricolage. Collision city includes both, I quote, closed compositions and ad hoc stuff in between. The model for Rowe as well is, again, Rome. 17th century Rome, that collision of palaces, piazze, and villas. He writes that inextricable fusion of imposition and accommodation, an anthology of closed compositions, and here it comes, ad hoc stuff in between. So Rome, still quoting from Rowe, whether imperial, papal, hard, or soft, is here offered as some sort of model which might be envisaged as alternative to the disastrous urbanism of social engineering of total design. Rome provides perhaps the most graphic example of collusive fields and interstitial debris. This is the moment that immediately precedes the collage. Literally, it's still fluid, it moves, but we still call it city. Massimo Cacciari publishes in 2004 a long essay called La Città, which comes from, interestingly enough, all these texts come from lectures, from talks, from seminars. He opens the text with an analysis of the Western unfortunately only Western, history and etymology of the word city. And at the very beginning, he denies or negates his topic. City does not exist. What exists are different and distinct forms of urban life. It is not by chance that city is named in different ways. And he looks at the origin and at these differences. He observes also that there is no equivalent in Latin for the Greek term polis. To the ethnic root, he calls it, of the polis, he opposes in his argumentation the mobile concept of civitas. Polis, he explains, is the place where the certain people, gens, genos, has its roots, and one belongs to the polis because there resides their genos. The polis is ontologically and genealogically determined. Civitas instead, and I quote again, is the product of the cives, a group of people gathering together in the same place and organizing themselves with shared laws. Civitas is the convergence of people, diversissime, very diverse for religion, ethnicity, etc., who concordano, puts their hearts together, agree, only by force of law. And I'm quoting bits and pieces from the text. One becomes a citizen because si concorda, one agrees to obey those laws and to obey that regime called concordia in Latin. So civitas is based on an agreement, a contract among the diverse, the very diverse. It is heterogeneous. It is open, and as such is open to the possible deviations of the heteroclitos, heteroclite. Even Rome, the urbs, the city, super, foundational, representative, symbolic, institutional, monumental, self-celebratory. We just fished out the adjectives from Cacciari's text, but I presume we all agree with them, is, I quote, founded on the agreement and the work of people who had been bound by their own city. It is the place where exiles, wanderers, refugees, outlaws converge. Urbs is not the city of a defined group or race. And then he continues, and apologies for quoting at length, but I think it really renders the idea. The city is mobile in its very essence, Roma mobilis. Even the extremely dynamic nature of the myth of its origin enables it to imagine itself and construct its own myth through the synthesis of the most diverse elements, brought together not by their past, but by a common goal. This is the city projected towards the future, writes Cacciari. More than a foundational idea, this city is a foundational strategy. The city is thrust forward toward the future, and in this project, it brings together its citizens. Of course, here the goal of all the citizens is to have what Cacciari, using Latin, calls the imperium sine fine, the empire without borders, where ultimately the orbs becomes urbs and the urbs becomes orbis. But what is interesting here is that the fundamental programmatic character of the civitas is growth, but in the sense that it dilates, and this is, I think, where it becomes interesting for us today, because it dilates in the sense that de lyra is the furrow, the mark that binds the city. And one, and I'm quoting Cacciari, one is delirious when one trespasses the liras and exits the secure boundaries of the city. So for Cacciari, it's important not to dismiss the city as a site of this acute contradiction, he calls it, that cannot be resolved. But instead, it's important for him to start from this contradiction to, he says, value it, explore it, and explode it. And then this is the beginning, and then he moves on to sort of a history or interrogation of the history of the city, with the dissolution of urban identity brought about by the metropolis, and then the post-metropolis of the territory city, and the temporal rather than spatial relations of what he calls the deterritorialized territory. But then, as a call, it calls attention to bodies and places and the duty of form of what he calls ultimately beauty. But this is a beauty that he defines in the sense of the Albertian congenitas as symphony of the different, to rethink the city. Still, we still call it city. Maybe we don't. Around the same years, 2003, the Metapolis Dictionary of Advanced Architecture under city tells us an old word, city or multi-city, and that's it. Again, roughly same years, 2001, Saskia Sassen in talking about the global digital world is a bit more mild. To more fully understand the impact of the digital and globalization, we need to suspend the category city. Rather, we need to construct a more abstract category of centrality and of spaces of centralities that ironically could allow us to recover the city, albeit a recovery is just one instantiation within a much broader set of issues, unquote. So suspend, construct, recover the city, but within a much broader set of issues. How? Georges Bataille, in the text The Labyrinth, here I'm going back to the mid-30s, to discuss what he calls the composite character of beings, uses the image of the labyrinth as an image of incompleteness and even more importantly, an intrinsic unknowability. And he uses it to suggest that at the basis of a human life lies the principle of insufficiency, he calls it. It is this insufficiency that determines a dynamic form of being, questions the stability of human social forms. Then the labyrinth is important because while it is one of the archetypal spaces at the origin of architecture, it is also characterized by mutable and experiential qualities. It is not a form that can be defined and known in its every detail. And we know the story. So for Bataille, the labyrinth is the image of the human being as a being in relation, whose relationality is mediated by words and by the representation of existence that are constructed through language. Yet knowing, he says, when a man knows his neighbor, still talking in the masculine, is never anything but existence composed for an instant. Here things become interesting. Bataille extends the idea of the temporary and unstable nature of connection between human beings from the interpersonal relations to a much vaster and complex network society. He writes, the knowledge of human beings appears as a mode of biological connection, unstable, but just as real as the connections between cells in tissue. And he continues, the exchange between two human particles, in fact, possess the faculty of surviving momentary separation. Now, there are two important points here. One is that the connection between humans forming what he calls unstable and entangled wholes does not occur in isolation, but within what he calls a tissue, a connection within connections. And the other one is that this connection is not only momentary and label, but also productive of memory. It leaves traces that enable the acknowledgement and the recognition of the past, and therefore allows for both physical and temporal discontinuity in these relations. So being is precarious and negotiated, and yet Bataille acknowledges the formation in this relational system of what he calls knots or concentrations, nuclei, where being hardens. It is at this point that he shifts the argument from the idea of being to its multiple aggregations, to society, and to the city, city as key form of expression. I don't know if I have the quote, I don't. I'll read it. With a multiple aggregation of being, relatively stable wholes are produced, whose center is a city. In its early form, a corolla that encloses a double pistil of sovereign and God, in the case where many cities abdicate their central function in favor of a single city, an empire forms around the capital where sovereignty and the gods are concentrated. The gravitation around a center then degrades the existence of peripheral cities, where the organs that constituted the totality of being willed. This is the history of civilization in 3 lines. So this is essentially a condensed description of the history of the European city, and not only European, but it's also the history of the super urban centralization produced and organized by nation states. What is interesting, though, is that, again, Bataille does not stop here. He sets the whole process in motion through cycles of construction, distractions, organizations, and explosions. Universality, says, at the summit causes all existence to explode and decomposes it with violence. As dynamic as being, the city changes. And indeed, it can be only if it changes. And the change, this is not Bataille, this is me, far from smooth or gradual, is produced by the explosion or of a discontinuity. And here, there's this wonderful image of the laughter that determines beings, but in a very dynamic way. It manifests time, but each time change, but this is a sudden change, and so it bursts. It characterizes all vacant lives as ridiculous. And laughter, though, it assembles not only those who laugh at, but also those who are those who laugh, but also those who are laughed at. It most often decomposes without consequence, and sometimes with a virulence that is so pernicious that it even puts in question composition itself and the wholes across which it functions. So laughter becomes the expression of a tension that activates societies and cities as dynamic fields. It manifests itself in the paroxysm that produce both cohesion and discontinuity, laughing at, establish both relations of association, opposition, produce condensations in groups, and construct differences. But both of them are, again, always labeled, volatile, renegotiable. And the laughter is contagious in both the associative and the dissociative way. And so this idea enables him, Bataille, to suggest the questioning of the questioning of the centrality of power and of the city by means of the very same forces that produce them. This network of relations that organize social life so is destabilized and set in motion. The center is emptied of meaning and of its controlling power, and the pyramidal social order is shaken, and so on, again and again, in a collective convulsion that destabilizes, making a city that is never complete and is constantly redefined in an open relation to others, like language, and we could say like laughter. The city puts us in relation to others in a way that cannot be controlled. So, is it dead? Sanford Quinter echoes this in his Requiem for a City at the End of the Millennium, or, as we should read it, Requiem, pause, for the city at the end of the millennium. And here it defines the city as a perpetually organizing field of forces and movement, each city a specific and unique combination of historical modalities in dynamic composition. This is in one of the earlier essays in the book. And towards the end, although the city has disappeared, it is nevertheless here to stay, a clumsy paradox. So by convention, we name a city those centers of gravitation of beings, Bataille would say, in which relatively stable social groups converge. We continue to decline the word in innumerable versions: appropriation, adaptation, reinventions in time and space. But what I hope I have not proven in any way, but just suggested, is that this exactitude is necessary for the word city to be, as much as change is necessary in order for the city to be, and to allow us to talk about it, to communicate it, to inhabit it. I suppose there cannot be a conclusion here. The city continues to englobe the heterogeneous and the heteroclite, the unexpected, the impossible. So let me just complete the sentence by Beckett from The Unnameable, with which I started. Where I am, I don't know, I'll never know. In the silence, you don't know, you must go on. I can't go on, I'll go on, but I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Perhaps I can try to formulate the question. First of all, thank you for taking us to so many wonderful images of different cities in text and in image. And I think the question that I have for you is, it's somewhat developing in my mind, so feel free to also not answer, but to me, what is very interesting is that you're talking about the city as a place where many things coalesce. And in a way, you've done a beautiful job kind of describing that through some very specific moments in history in some very specific cities. But I guess one of the questions that I have is that the city of today and perhaps tomorrow is also characterized by maybe a sense of isolation or kind of an introversion on behalf of the citizens on their own screens and their own lives. And so I just wonder, do you want to talk a little bit about cities of today and tomorrow? Or anyhow, of how we can kind of.
Okay. Yeah, I can. I'm not going to answer, but it's the two things. One, I really wanted to. But I mean, I'm not doing it. Calvino did it. It's the opening up this fact of the idea of exactitude is not exact. It also, so there's this sort of extra space. There's room for all these not very exact things to happen. And that's, I think, what is the fascinating thing. And that is why, okay, city, I mean, it's translations, but the fact that it's different versions, we need to have this term. So I don't want to be obvious or polemical, but I would say that this is another part of the city of today. So this is us talking here. And I'm not even going to talk about square, because maybe we don't have squares anymore. Maybe there's other things. But when your amazing invitations came, well, of course, the first reaction, by instinct, exactitude is not exact. Actually, maybe the question is more for Mark. You know, the difference between precision and exactitude. That opens another conversation. The city needs the mess, the debris, all this this ad hoc stuff, all these different terms used at different times. But I was really fascinated by the persistence of the use of the word, even when we have the idea of the urban, which is related, or polis, but in general, because we need this term of this coming together. I think probably us here in the screens is a bit too organized. It's very clean. I'm sure we will find way to mess up this as well, which is very interesting. So yeah, maybe it's hybrid, maybe it's many other things, maybe it's not only beyond the spatial into the temporal. We need to find another dimension. I was thinking earlier when Antoine was talking about the idea of the artificial, apologies, I'm calling everybody by first name, and even if I don't know you personally, forgive me. The idea of the artificial intelligence, I think there was some question from the audience on the relation with the idea of queerness, and it's an amazing possibility of thinking the what we don't know yet. Maybe there can be 27 genders next year, and maybe then there will become, if we still want to call them genders or identities, more. And that we're restricted by our very limited number of pronouns. Okay, now I'm really delirious. I'm going on a tangent, but this is the city. If this screen is what allows us to have this conversation, this is the city. And then of course we have the body, and there's the counterpart of the bodily and of the space out there. But if that doesn't remain, and I can imagine it moving it from our machines to us, to downstairs in my case, but if this very inexact exactitude is lost, then we need to throw away that name, and then what do we become? I'm going to stop here because I'm going on a tangent. Sorry.
There are more questions. I'll let Laura or Michael take it away and read you the question or ask you more questions.
There's one question expanding on your question, Harry. How does the current pandemic challenge the stability of the city? We're not able to engage in its infrastructure and to create the messiness of interaction right now.
I don't know where the person who asked the question is, but I invite them to come to London. It's very messy. Now there are lots of changes. I mean, there's been debates going on for months now, but not only debates, because while we were quarantined, other colleagues, other people were working, and the cities have already been redesigned with anything from pedestrian spaces, distance spaces, spaces for retail, and the way we use them. So the physical changes out there are already implementing what we're doing here. In this, I see now a series of almost stamps of micro screens. Yeah, absolutely, it has changed already. It is changing. So we are in this. Sorry, I'm saying very, very trite things because we live daily in these things. We need to keep a distance out there, but now we are all in each other's whatever attic, basement, living room, wherever you are. So there are different levels of intimacy. I think this unexpected but well, predictable situation of the pandemic has accelerated transformations, maybe produced also others which we couldn't even foresee. But I think what is interesting is the variety of the responses. Okay, some are too slow, but the inventiveness, maybe I shouldn't use the word, but the capacity to, again, have this flexible thing. And I don't think we'll stop using the word. I suspect, I'm definitely not a psychologist, but we need to cling also to some, it's not just a label, it's more of a container of accumulation of memories and shared history. And here I'm becoming Aldorossian, so I think I should stop.
Michael, do you have any questions?
Well, maybe just to follow that up about COVID, and I think Francesca Hughes raised this yesterday about this being, in light of I guess the factors of mobility and oscillation and the approximate and the collisions and the contradictions that you raised about the city, and then governments using this to seeming to really kind of limit the possibilities of oscillations and collisions and interactions. Is this I guess, in terms of the city, a set of circumstances that's being taken out of architects and planners' hands and essentially being appropriated by the state and by those in authority?
Yeah, I think if it is a problem for us, and by us I mean architects, it is a problem for us as architects, but first of all as citizens. That I think is why it is really important to continue talking, because we need to be citizens, and again, for lack of a better word, which is linked to city, but before thinking of ourselves as designers, because if we want to design spaces which reflect an imposition which comes from outside, but outside is other citizens, other human beings, whether we have elected them or not. The issue is to maybe be, human beings and citizens before being architects, which means discuss these things of limitations of freedoms and control. But again, the pandemic has brought us in this state of exception, basically, where we are governed by decree every day, and almost everywhere in the world by now. But it's nothing new. So in a very painful way, the situation we are living in now is making more evident a situation we already had. So I don't want to sound cynical, but if this makes us take a strong position and see the agency of the, let's call it designer, not just architect, as an important responsibility to even just show the relationship between the organization of spaces and how we use them and the political, it's a huge task. Of course, we want to stay alive first because we are all scared. But I think, again, it's as if we were all of a sudden stripped of a lot of screens and not lies, but veils of things we were hiding behind. Now we are responsible. We are more responsible for whether we want it or not. We're more responsible for others than for ourselves. So maybe we've always been. We should have always been. But now it's literally not on our skin, it's inside our bodies. So I see, I mean, we've seen it in the presentations, and I really wish to thank you, the design presentations, the designers, the practitioners, because they do it firsthand. I just talk about it. And I think they just practice what I'm talking about. So maybe the question is more for other speakers.